Um, Thanks everyone for being here. I'm super jittery and anxious, so I guess having this hour to focus on something else is a good thing. And I loved all the comments about what we're all hoping for. So let's just keep moving forward in hope, and let's also hope that we can transform Minnesota's early childhood financing system. So my name is Krista Anders. I'm happy to be here with you today. I serve as the coordinator for Transforming Minnesota's Early Childhood Workforce Project. And as part of that work, we have had a subcommittee for the last year working on transforming the financing of early care and education. And that work is based on this book from the National Academies of Sciences. It's a consensus study on what we need to do in this country to make a better future for our children. So I'm joined here today with my colleague Rob Grunewald from the Federal Reserve, and I'm grateful for all of the team members, but I'm particularly grateful for Rob, who agreed to be here with us today. And when I was saying earlier I couldn't do this work without him, I meant it. All of the folks that are contributing to our work are really instrumental in getting this work moving forward. So what we're going to do today is what I call a sweetened condensed version of the presentation that we gave to the Prenatal 3 Policy Forum in October. I know Deb set out the link to that video, and hopefully some of you have watched it. For those of you who didn't have a chance to watch it, we're going to do a shortened presentation today and then have some time for a conversation and questions and dialogue with all of you. So feel free to ask questions along the way, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I can't really see the chat, so if there are questions that come up in the chat, maybe Deb, you can monitor those. Perfect. All right, so you all know this. The financing model for early care and education in Minnesota is profoundly broken. It's broken in Minnesota, it's broken across the country. Many low-income families cannot access childcare. There's waiting lists, they can't afford it. There's a shortage of slots and programs. These issues have all, of course, been exacerbated by COVID. And it's not just low-income families who have trouble accessing childcare. Across all income levels, childcare is unaffordable and the payments are regressive. So that's just the problem for the families. Underneath all that, of course, we have the problem for the providers. So our early childhood educators receive very low wages with either little or no benefits, which impedes their ability to deliver consistent high quality care, and means that many of them are literally subsidizing working parents, businesses, and our economy through their poverty level wages. In addition to the poverty level wages, there are gender and racial justice issues for the early childhood workforce that need to be rectified. Our current financing system simply does not work for children. It does not work for parents. It does not work for employers, and it does not work for the early educators. We know that we can do better. All right, how do I move my slides on this view? There we go. So this is a graphic from the National Academies report, and what our group has been trying to do is figure out that gap, where that pink arrow is pointing to, that gap in funding of what the difference is between what we currently pay for and what a high quality system really needs in order to be fully funded. So we call this the stuff coming out of the funnel, the spaghetti. And that really shows that the financing for early childhood is a layering of separate programs with different funding streams, constituencies, eligibility requirements, and quality standards. And you can see that some of the funding goes to high quality, some of the funding goes to low quality, and all those little gray children down there, those are kids that are just shut out of the system entirely. Those kids aren't accessing care anywhere. And so that's a problem. We know that the overall compensation for the workforce is low, that those numerous children aren't served at all. And you can see that the families pay the bulk of the costs right now, about 52%, with federal and state governments and local governments paying approximately 46%. The private sector has that tiny little 2%. And so there's just this big gap in funding between what we're paying for right now and what we need. All right, here's that slide that Deb showed earlier. So really we're focused on, when I say we, I mean my team, the Transforming the Financing team has been focused on that green box. What is that true cost? There's the revenue generation stuff on the left and the distribution mechanisms on the right. And those are really important issues. It's really how you raise the money and then how you spend the money. And in 2 weeks, Deb and other colleagues are going to be talking about the revenue generation side, thinking about dedicated funding streams and other ways to raise money. And we're looking forward to that and working and aligning our work with that. And then on the distribution side, there's a variety of things to consider, and we'll have some high-level recommendations about that. And we know that many of you are working in these different spaces and that you've got thoughts and expertise in that area, and we look forward to conversations with you on that as well. So this is a slide about that connects to that distribution comment that I just made. It's a really important high-level summary of our distribution approach. So you see at the bottom that family income level increases as you go across your screen. And so as family income goes up, family contributions go up and the public assistance goes down. You can see at the far left-hand side of your screen that family assistance is all the way to the top, meaning that for the lowest income families, they are getting 100% supported by public dollars. And then as your income increases, then that public contribution goes down. What I want to talk about is that bottom, that institutional provider support, that light gray bar. That's something that we have not generally done in Minnesota for early care and education until the pandemic. Actually, the peacetime emergency grants and the federal CARES Act dollars that we have been distributing across the state have been this institutional provider support. And when we think about, that institutional provider support is completely different from the family tuition or the fees or the government subsidies that are paid. It's this foundational layer that we need at the bottom in order to shore up the whole system. And we believe that fully supporting high quality early care and education in Minnesota is going to take a wholesale transformation of how we think about how we fund early care and education system. And one of the biggest shifts in our thinking is getting rid of that concept that tuition and parent fees alone are adequate. We need to think about early care and education like we think about higher education or public transportation. So yes, it's true that college students pay tuition and that people who ride the light rail or the bus pay fares, but they don't, and they can't in most instances, pay the full costs. The government supports the basic infrastructure for public colleges and universities, as well as—
Track, can you stop for just a second? I think somebody's off mute. So if everybody could just double check and make sure you're muted, that would be great. Sorry, I didn't want to, okay, go, sorry.
Okay, no problem. So just that, it's that underlying support. Like you think about when you get on the bus and you pay your fare, it's not supporting the full cost. The government is supporting that basic infrastructure because it's an important part of our society and the way that we need to function. And early child care is the exact same thing. It's an important part of what our society needs to function. So that's the model that we need. All right, so I mentioned this Transforming the Workforce report. It comes in at 302 pages. And if you're interested, I really do encourage you to read it. It's available for free online at our website. But if you want to be spared the 302 pages, this is the summary of the key recommendations. So it's federal and state governments should establish consistent standards for high quality across all ECE programs. Receipt of public funding should be linked to attaining and maintaining these high quality standards. State and federal financing mechanisms should ensure that providers receive payments that are sufficient to cover the total cost of high quality ECE. This also is a huge transformation in how we think about it. Think about how this last session we were fighting for 25% of the market rate, which even market rate doesn't cover the total cost. So we really need to think about total cost, and that's what we need to fund. Family contributions need to be affordable, and payments for those families at the lowest income level should be reduced to zero. And then we need a progressive system of contribution as family income increases. The early childhood workforce needs support in order to increase knowledge and competencies and gain the credentials that they need, and also have the increased compensation that is commensurate with the services that they are providing. And finally, there needs to be harmonized funding and that institutional support to providers who meet quality standards. So that's a lot. That's a quick summary. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and are there any questions on what I've talked about so far?
Up and in the chat. Please feel free to throw your questions in the chat and I can convey them. So,
all right, then I'm going to turn it over to Rob. And Rob, I will drive and you just let me know. I kind of know when you're going to move, but.
Sure, that sounds great. Can you hear me okay? Good. So good to see you all. I see a lot of familiar names at this meeting, which is great to see. What I'd say is what I'll present is very brief work that Aaron Sojourner and the rest of the group have been working on to provide a framework about how to tabulate these costs over time. And I think I saw Aaron briefly on the call, so he might be available for questions too when we get to that part. So it's in the draft form, and what we're going to be doing is looking at what it would cost to first cover all costs for low-income families, and then what it would cost to cover a portion of costs for moderate and higher income families. So here we'll show ways that we can have public funding gradually decrease as family income increases. We recognize that with a sharp decrease in benefits, it can create unintended consequences, such as an incentive to avoid earning more income when family income is just below an eligibility threshold. We'll look at the share of expenses that are paid by families and government as we change these policy options. And then finally, we'll create a space for where we'd be able to increase the payments from government in order to support higher quality levels. So note that the math that we're doing here doesn't include larger system level support so far, such as funding to help teachers achieve degrees or increase coaching, such as parent aware, or increased funding for early care and education facilities. Also, what we're talking about today, we're just bringing all of the various program types together, including child care centers, family child care, Head Start, public school-based pre-K, and into one group, and we're looking at the total dollar number. So we're not specifying how much each program would receive after this. We really just want to get our arms around total. We know some things pretty well. First of all, we know the number of children and families by family income because we can turn to the American Community Survey data. We also know federal and state funding allocated to early care and education. And so here we're looking not only at what's allocated from federal and state sources, but also Aaron and I are looking at how to estimate the amount of tax credit, the value of tax credits, both from the state and federal that are paid to families. And then also we have a good understanding of market prices for childcare. So that's what I would say about the market prices for childcare is what we're able to do is look across both centers and family-based programs across the 4 different price clusters. And when we are able to allocate costs by population, we have $10,615 for age 0 to 5. And then we break it up for different costs for age 0 to 2 and 3 to 4. So let's go to the next slide. So what we don't know, what we have less information about, is the true cost of providing high quality early care and education. We're learning more about that, but we don't have a definitive price for that. The total local government spending on early care and education. We are also unclear about the number of children who use multiple federal and state funding streams. How families respond to the availability of government funding, and also an increase in early care and education quality. And there's a lot unknown about the federal government policy, and in terms of what that total costs are going to be that they're going to potentially be picking up in the future. So we'll go to the next slide. So the way we frame this is that we assume that participation rates in this model, in this framework, are 60% for children ages 0 to 2 and 80% for ages 3 to 4. And then we map out the current amount of public investment by low income, which is up to 185% of poverty. So the poverty line is at 26,200. At 185%, that is just over 48,000. Moderate income we define as 185% of poverty to 300% of poverty. That 300% of poverty is just over 78,000. So this is what the share would look like as a starting point. So as noted, we equate just the baseline cost per child as the weighted average of median market rate prices. We recognize that that's not the true cost of providing childcare, but it's a number that we do know and where we can start from. So let's go to the next slide. So in this scenario, we create two policies. One is that low-income families have no co-payment, so that all of their costs are paid for. And that all other families, moderate income and higher income families, contribute 7% of their income, and that's the cap of their contribution. And that 7% number comes from the U.S. Department of Human Services, where some years ago they provided guidance that co-payments on child care subsidies should go no higher than 7% of a family income. And I thought it was, we all think it's important just to see what this looks like in terms of the shift of payments from families that have been paying it to governments in each of these three groups. Of course, low-income families are covering it all. Moderate income families are covering between 63 and 68%. Now is covered by government, and then even higher income is getting some support in there, about 25 to just over 30%. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is a table of the current federal and state investments. We're including both, let's see. So this is where we have essentially the numbers that are behind the past chart that you saw. I need to move my screens around so I make sure I see the right number. So the total cost of new additional income for covering all low-income families, we're estimating about $355 million per year. And this is just to note is quite similar to what Close Gaps by 5 and Erica Moss, and I've worked with Erica on these numbers before, has estimated that to reach all low-income families that could benefit from investment in early care and education would be somewhere between that $350 and $400 million per year. So then with the 7% cap for moderate income, it goes up to $301 million a year to cover that portion for that group, and then for higher income, over 300% at $335 million. So altogether, getting close to $1 billion a year. So we'll go to the next slide. So then the question comes, what if we were to increase on all of these payments at a level that would provide extra resources to providers for quality? And the way we're constructing this as a way to think about it is, what if every dollar that went out to providers was now $1.50, so that they would receive a 50% increase in the amount of resources that they receive. This first chart just shows the share of government contribution increases for both moderate income and higher income families when we increase all those payments out by 50%. And then we'll go to the next slide. And this is the table that shows the results. So when we increase payments to providers by 50%, so for the low income group, that gets up to $841 million a year. And then you see the increases both for moderate and higher income families. So altogether, that increases it to $2.4 billion a year. So this is you can go to the next slide. So this is a starting place to be able to look at populations, how much is being paid out, both in terms of how we might change the policy. So how would we do that? So we could change the overall family contribution rate for moderate and higher income families. For example, we also have these same numbers for making a cap at 10% of income. Could also implement a higher contribution rate as family income increases. That is, make this a progressive strategy so that as income goes higher, the share of contribution by each family increases. And then finally, you can, of course, as we zero in on what the quality component of this, we could change that quality contribution. So with that, I'll turn it back to Krista.
So we get it. For those of you who haven't heard this before, 2.4 billion sounds like a lot, and it is. And so we're recommending that we phase this in. We understand that Minnesota is facing budget deficits. We know there's not an extra 2.4 billion hanging around, and likely won't be for many, many years. And we know that Minnesota can't afford that all on its own. We're going to need some support from the federal government. So what we're recommending is phasing in the costs over a 12-year period. We had initially thought we would propose a 10-year period, but with COVID and the pandemic, we knew that it would probably take longer. So you can see that the focus in phase one is really to stop the bleeding, respond to COVID, increase access as federal funds come in. We believe that there likely will be federal funds coming in. There probably won't be a lot of state funds in the next year or two with the budget deficits. And then we need to build, in phase one, we need to build that infrastructure for transforming the system. And that includes transforming the workforce by beginning to implement the power of the profession infrastructure. In that second phase, then we propose increasing coverage to add the moderate income families. That's in the second phase, we cover the low income children and the priority children. And then in the third phase, we add moderate income. And then in the fourth phase, we add the higher income families.
Like the twins or the Vikings.
Excuse me, somebody has their mute off. Could
what kind you want?
everybody double check and make sure you're muted?
Well, then don't. You don't have to.
Hello?
All right, I'll just keep going.
It looks like it's Daniel Hayden.
All right, so all along the bottom, in all of these phases, we've got support for the workforce, and that includes everyone, including FFN providers, family care, center-based care, and the like. Over the 12 years, we continue to focus on building capacity and increasing quality so that by the end of the 12 years, all programs are high quality. In order to do that, we really need to invest in supporting the workforce, supplementing wages, supporting higher education, increasing the numbers of teachers of color, and investing in quality improvements and systems. So Rob talked a little bit about some of our next steps in terms of costing out some of those other policy choices. We know we need to get more granular with some of the details. For example, we know we need to invest in higher ed, but what does that really mean? We know that we're going to run out of really the PhD level faculty who are teaching that next generation of workforce. So we need to understand better how many faculty do we need, those kinds of issues. If you think back to the slide I shared near the beginning that had that revenue generation and distribution mechanisms, we've got to work with others, many of you on the Zoom here today, figuring out what does that really look like. We'd like to have alignment so that when we do get to an advocacy point, that we're all in agreement on what would make sense. So we'll be having lots of conversations with you. So we're grateful for this opportunity to share our work here today. You can go to our website for some background, and of course, email me at that email there with questions, comments, ideas. And we look forward to hearing some of your questions now.
So there was a variety of Q&A going on in the chat. For those of you, I don't know how many people can't see the chat, but there was some questions about cliff effects and different ways of thinking about the cost per child cost of childcare currently and in this model, etc. Are there a lot of folks on the call that aren't able to see that? I'm just trying to get a read of whether I should read all that or if people can see it. All right, sounds like maybe most people can see it. So questions, comments?
Well, I'll ask a question that I had asked in the chat, and that is that Representative Pinto has been talking about a $1.5 billion investment this upcoming year, and I'm wondering if his calculations are based on some of yours.
I see that Erin is on the phone, on the Zoom, also answering questions. And I know Rob has been talking with Representative Pinto. I haven't talked to him specifically about his 1.5 number. Rob, have you?
I have not specifically. If Erin has, and I know that obviously Representative Pinto was part of the conversation a couple of weeks ago with the Prenatal to 3 Policy Forum.
What, Denise, we can follow up with this. Representative Pinto has seen Rob and Erin's memo that kind of undergirds all of this work that you just saw.
Yeah, I think that would be useful to know, just because he's mentioned this dollar figure to a lot of people, and I haven't understood entirely where it comes from. And so if it was based on some of these calculations, that would be useful to know.
I agree.
So I will just say that we are hoping that this was in the message that went out, the email message for our next meeting on November 17th, to have legislators be part of that conversation. So that might be a good question to put to them if we don't have an answer before then.
This is Beth Menninga, and I wanted to repeat my question because I don't think anyone's responded to it. Related to workforce issues, wages and benefits. The Child Care Center for the Study of Child Care Employment has shown that we don't necessarily get wage increases when we invest in the system. So how would we build mechanisms in place, or what would we build in place to ensure that a consistent amount of funding goes in it, and also addressing it as you're phasing in? You'd have to build that in from the ground up, because you don't want that to be a surprise at the end. In my opinion, that would be problematic. So what are some mechanisms you're talking about, or maybe you haven't gotten that far yet, around this issue?
I'll offer a few comments and see if Krista and Erin, if you want to say more. I think it's a great point. Obviously one of the policy purposes of being able to increase investment within the system is to make sure that we are able to attract high quality staff, and that we are able to retain staff and reduce turnover, and we have enriched interactions between our teachers and children. And being able to increase their wages is going to be an important mechanism in order for that to happen. So I think the point to your point, Beth, here is, what you're noting is that what CSCCE has been able to point out is we've had this increase in investment overall, within early care and education, but we're not seeing the show up in wages. And part of that could, I think there's two pieces there, is that a lot of the emphasis has been increasing access as opposed to quality. That is increasing the amounts that are paid to providers. So that could be one piece of it. And then I think your other point is, can we be sure that if we do increase, let's say if we don't just go straight to wages, but we just provide more payments to providers overall, will those resources actually go to the staff on hand? And I think that it could be able to test whether there's ways that you can actually fund the wages directly to teachers. I think that what we'd be balancing is the effectiveness and efficiency of being able to do that. Of course, being able to distribute funding to providers relative to the number of the children that they're caring for, and having them work with their business model is certainly an effective and efficient way to do this. Ways to be able to supplement wages certainly has been done. There's just a cost of efficiency in doing that. But I think at this point, our work has been getting at the dollar total. And I think getting at this question would be like the next step, is how would this most effectively be rolled out and make sure that we do it in the best way.
One idea that I keep bugging people about is we could invest in a gross way across the board in one benefit, and that would be healthcare for the system, without impacting some of those other issues in the same way. So that's just an idea I'd like to keep thinking about, because it would benefit everyone that's working in the field.
Yeah, thanks.
Matthew raises a super important issue, and you're absolutely right that the wages do not increase, but as people earn higher and higher credentials. So the median wage of a childcare worker in Minnesota is around $11.44 an hour. The data from DEED shows that 2 years after getting a bachelor's degree in early care and education, those workers are getting about $15 an hour. That's 2 years after graduation. So the wages are just problematic. And Cindy Cunningham, who's in the chat, points out that wages is an odd term for folks who are solo practitioners and running their own businesses. They don't really get wages or salary. They have a draw or a profit or whatever, but we're using the term compensation kind of broadly to cover all of those ways that people get income to support themselves. So at the same time that we've had this financing team working, there's also been a team that a number of folks on the call have been on, including Cindy. That work has been funded by the Teach Early Childhood National Center, and it's been called Moving the Needle on Compensation. And that team has just wrapped up, and that's where some of those recommendations about implementing the power of the profession infrastructure come in. And as part of that, we've been developing salary scales that correspond to the different power of the profession designations. So that's Early Childhood Educator 1, Early Childhood Educator 2, Early Childhood Educator 3, that correspond to a CDA, an AA, and a bachelor's degree. And so we've done some analysis of DEED data and other professions with similar credentials, and have proposed just right now for illustrative purposes a salary scale. Some other states have done some innovative work with figuring out how to supplement wages to align with those salary scales. I think we're going to come out of this pandemic and we're going to see that we've lost a lot of providers, and that we're going to have a hard time recruiting people in. And one of the ways to increase recruitment is to have a reasonable wage or compensation on the other end. And the wages right now simply are not reasonable. No, but none of you would encourage your children to go into this unless they're independently wealthy.
Cindy here. I have to jump in. I'm sorry. Thank you, Krista and Rob, for your work and for this. I will interject what I put into the chat, what Krista and Rob and others have heard me repeatedly say. If we are going to be inclusive in this discussion and have a broad discussion over all of this, terminology does matter. We are not workers. Even the employees and whatever within the childcare settings Workers is not a terminology that I continue to feel is an appropriate use, in particular for licensed family child care providers. Wages is also not. So those of us who are independent business owners, to pull us in on this conversation of this overall compensation, which, yes, I've been on the powered, I've been on a lot of conversations and I always bring this up. It's like for us to be able to find our little spot in this conversation, I am challenging everybody to start thinking of different language. I have to do acrobatics and I get defensive, or Krista smiles, and I have to re-explain how my business works. Constantly because to fit into this square hole, circle, whatever we want to call about it. Okay. I explained it to Krista and to Ariana, wrong name. A few weeks ago, as a business owner, I have within reason, an ability to have the control over my income. In family child care, what's not taken into account in those numbers is that business owners can choose to run their business to their capacity and to their income as that fits their ability. I make significantly more than $11 an hour. I want to tell you, I guess I'm the one that brings up the bottom. Because I run full, I run at my capacity. I have a BA degree in additional education. Would I like to make more? Sure. But as a business owner, I don't fit a lot of the conversation, the capacity, the compensation. So, and I'm a little angsty here, I guess, maybe, but I keep hearing, we're just going to use this language. And I'm going to say, really, in what other business category or anything that's gone on in our society, in particular right now, can we just say that this is the language we're going to use, and I'm supposed to, as a significant part of a provider group in this state, somehow figure out where I'm supposed to fit in this, not get defensive and feel like I always have to re-explain myself, and find how I can either buy in or have a constructive conversation in this process. I believe in lots of the pieces that are thrown out. It just takes a lot of energy to try to engage in the conversation without doing the push. So I think wages need to be looked at. That conversation that just was, okay, great. If we do these things, the centers, if I was a center employee, no, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't go for that dollar income. That's on the centers. That's on the chains. That is accountability, and I've raised it before in the group that Krista was just commenting on, is if there's going to be more money go into some of those organizations and some of those tracks, there needs to be some accountability that those people who truly are employees get the compensation and the benefit packages that should go down to them rather than to the corporate heads in particular. So I will calm down, but please, let's work on different terminology so I don't have to continue to lecture and have it come back. I can't find myself.
Cindy, there's a question in the comments. I think, everyone would be open to hearing kind of, do you have different language that you think this group should be employing?
And usually I don't like to complain without putting something out. I think providers, professional terminology, not workers. And again, I appreciate the question. It's been a struggle because I keep feeling like I've been trying to be heard for over the last few years. So I think people who are termed as providers, whether they're working within a center or whether they're working as a business owner, is good. Income, compensation. Compensation is a reasonable word, not wages. Compensation is actually more inclusive to those benefit challenges that we have. So I would really rather broaden that language. So sometimes I have to take a deep breath and not do my emotional reaction. I apologize. So I'll work on that a little bit more, but providers, compensation, income, benefits, those are things, but wages and some of those other conversations don't fit at all for family child care.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that.
Just
Sorry, Rob?
Oh, real quick, sorry. Cindy, I completely hear what you're saying and understand your approach and perspective. Let me just add food for thought for everyone as we think about our messaging. I will say, as a some maybe around on the Zoom have worked at the legislature and pushed very large packages before, but back a good handful of years ago, I worked on the 5% campaign, which is now the Better Life Alliance, and certainly that was all about raising provider rates, but the messaging was raising wages for workers, and just let's be cognizant of the audience as we do refine the messaging, because raising wages for workers is something that legislators respond well to versus compensation for business owners, not as much. Just food for thought.
Okay.
And I do appreciate that, Rob, and we've had many conversations on all of these things. I think at minimum, there has to be some way that we can have this conversation in a broader, and as long as everybody, and I agree with the legislative part. I mean, I've been years trying to figure out how to work with legislators as a small business, but if we as an advocacy group and in all these areas, if we can't figure out how to have conversations to where they're inclusive, we can't expect anybody else to. And we do get left by the roadside in with some of these conversations in legislature. And if we had advocacy groups that help change that messaging, or at least make it more inclusive on this level, so we move forward, I think it's worth some effort to do it. If you want, I'm just going to put it this way, if you want licensed family child care to be in this conversation, supportive and move forward, I'm telling you, it is hard for me to get over some of these conversations, and I'm not that rigid most of the time. I don't know, maybe Krista and others would disagree, but I mean, I want to be in the discussion. It's just really difficult when I hear $11 an hour, and that is a misguided number. I know it comes from all reputable people in organizations, but they're not looking at licensed family child care the way the business is actually run. So maybe that just needs to be taken out to the side, but I would hope this group would at least be able to have some conversation and be broader and more inclusive. And then when we go forward, we can do some maybe modifying for me and others to keep dragging us along. So thank you though.
Okay, so I think that's just that is a good point, right? There's sort of how we communicate to different audiences, and there's how we kind of are working to build ourselves up as a community that understands and it's developing these relationships and understanding of the different pieces of the many flowered field, as Barty likes to talk about it. And being respectful about the different roles that people play and how that all fits together. So appreciate both Rob and Cindy bringing those perspectives forward. And Krista had mentioned in the chat that she's going to work on kind of thinking about the language within her slides. So I think we can all be working to think about language, because it is really, really important. So thanks for bringing that forward. Other questions?
Hey, this is Frank. I have a question for Krista and Rob and Aaron and others who worked on this. Is there anything that you have found surprising as you've kind of worked to build out this more macro view of our field and what's needed in Minnesota? Anything new that just surprised you or struck you in a new way?
I'll say one thing. We're starting with this strategy of looking at a family income cap, because that's been in discussion in the field. In the 7% number has been out there as a reasonable way to think about what a family income contribution could be. And so I thought it was just interesting to be able to see what does that look like and how that shifts the contributions from family tuition, families paying tuition, to what government would be supporting. And so I think it's instructive. And I think that that's where, you know, that's where you take this report and start to think about it. And we could also produce the same charts for a 10% cap. We could think about it in terms of having a more progressive rate, because I think people have different views on, you know, how much that increased. It was a notable increase for the moderate income group when you do a 7% cap, and also what that benefit looks like. So I thought that was instructive to me.
If no one else has a response to Frank's comment, I just wanted to bring up, Blake had put in the chat the question about quality and how we're kind of working across families, communities, teachers, others, to be thinking about what quality means. And obviously, you know, in this model, there's a 50% bump to increase quality. And so obviously there's, you know, still a lot of work, I think, to be done around you know, exactly what we mean when we say that word quality, and how we're doing that work in an inclusive way. Krista, did you want to say anything about on that point?
Well, you did a good job on that. I would add on the higher ed part and how they, I think Blake's point is important, that they play a key role in this. We have had in our work plan for the last 4 years a focus on transforming the higher ed system so that it works better, particularly for students who've been historically marginalized from higher education. We have a number of faculty on all of our work groups. And as part of Power to the Profession, there's a lot of pieces in there that would align with higher ed faculty. And the last piece I would add is that we just put in a research proposal to Cura. So if there's anyone on the line from Cura, you should accept this research proposal, where we want to reach out to all of the higher ed programs across Minnesota and see how those faculty are doing and how they fit into this work. So that would be an important next step. We just don't have the capacity right now to do that kind of outreach, but we know that their higher ed is a really important part of this entire system.
All right, well, we know that, as Krista's last slide said, this is an ongoing conversation. There's a lot of pieces of this that are going to be there's going to continue to be work on. And so I just want to thank Krista and Rob for bringing this forward, and Aaron and all the rest of the folks that were part of your group, who are either here today or not, for this important foundational work. Krista, is there anything else you want to say before we kind of wrap up with I just wanted to share a little bit about this revenue generation webinar and our plans for November 17th. But Krista, any last words?
I would just say thanks for the opportunity to share. Thanks for the kind comments in the chat, although I appreciate Cindy's less kind comments more, because that inspires us to figure out how do we've got to get everybody on board and aligned so that we can agree and actually make changes. So
Krista, you know I'm not being unkind. Come on.
I know. And I love you and all the work that you do, and I think you're amazing. So we're just going to figure it out. But, you know, keep sending us questions and ideas, and we'll just keep working together.
All right.
Just a quick technical question. Can we capture the comments in the chat?
Yes,
so that we can look at them later.
capture those, and I can send those out to you guys so you've seen the questions in case there's some follow-up or other things that are helpful from that. And we're obviously recording this, so we'll send it out to the whole group as well. So, and those that weren't able to be here. I just wanted to, before I talk a little bit about this webinar that we have coming up on November 16th, I wanted to talk about our next conversation on the 17th. I think Claire might be on. I can't see everybody that's on here, but is going to be leading kind of the next phase of our 2021 planning work. And that we hope is going to involve a first hour of checking in with legislators, obviously after we have the election results, and the Children's Cabinet to kind of get a read on from them what their priorities are and how they're thinking about 2021. And then we thought we would add an extra hour. That invite will go out, that calendar invite will go out for our own internal discussion after we have heard from legislators and the Children's Cabinet on all the various organizations and efforts that are represented here to be thinking about where we're aligned and how we think about working together moving forward. So expect that calendar invite and that should be coming out soon. Claire, is there anything else you want to say about that before we talk a little bit about the webinar? I think
no, but thank you.
All right, great. So we'll be back to you obviously with more details about the agenda and so on for that. With that, I wanted to just say a little bit about this webinar that we have coming up on the 16th at noon. And we'll just put the link to the, to the registration for that in the chat. But just wanting to, sorry, that's not advancing. I'm gonna stop sharing here for a second and try this again. So let's see. Sorry, folks. My technological challenge space. Okay, we're going to start from the beginning here. All right, so we already did this. That was Trista's part, so thank you again, Krista. Now we wanted to turn a little bit to some of the work we hope to do on this first piece, which Krista already highlighted as a sort of one piece of the whole, and obviously all these pieces kind of hang together. But we're hoping here in Minnesota to build on some important work that's being done nationally. Again, you know, nothing new here, right? This is coming from a national webinar that was just done on growing the pie for ECE, but I recognize that there's this, you know, overwhelming and growing voter support for public funding for ECE. We recognize the inequities, we recognize the underfunding. So, you know, building on that, thinking about how we as a community can come together to grow the pie and really deal with that huge part of the funnel that Krista pointed out is, you know, missing. And we obviously have not been as successful as we need to be. Thinking about just, you know, requesting funding from the general fund. So I think thinking about how we're getting creative and coming together as a community to take some responsibility for how we can help to push for a bigger pie. We know there's public support, as I said. We are hoping to maybe raise some funding to do a similar kind of poll here in the state of Minnesota to just kind of, I would assume, you know, just confirm that Minnesotans are similarly committed to this kind of way of thinking about early care and education. Again, we know that there's the national polling, and polling in other states is showing that this report is only growing and has only grown during COVID. So I think it's important to be thinking about how we're capitalizing on that in this moment. And so on 2 weeks from yesterday, we are going to be pulling together both some national folks and some folks from some other states, or Oregon in particular, as well as local folks to talk about just to start our local conversation about what it would mean to really come together as a community and, you know, again, play a role in thinking about how we're raising that revenue that we need to fill that part of the funnel that we're missing there. So Elizabeth Gaines, who's the founder and director of the Children's Funding Project, is going to be joining us, as well as Dana Hepper. She's the Director of Policy and Advocacy from Oregon Children's Institute. They've had some success in raising ECE-specific dedicated revenue. So we'll have them join us to basically get us sort of situated, setting the stage for the work we might do here in the state of Minnesota. And then we're going to present 3 different kind of models or sort of ways of thinking about revenue generation that are kind of moving in the state of Minnesota. The first one, I think Betsy's probably on, but the Minnesota Budget Project is working on some general revenue raising efforts, kind of thinking about investing as opposed to budget cuts, and knowing that was a really huge problem in the last recession and not wanting to recreate that here. As we move ahead, Isaiah and Education Minnesota have been doing some important, exciting work as well. And then there are some efforts in the state around a model that's a universal family care model. So those are just 3 ideas, but they're sort of setting the stage for, you know, there is important work already happening to think about revenue. And I think it's important that we as a community understand what these various efforts are currently, but also then to be using this this webinar as a jumping off point to a further work that we know we need to do. So in other states, you know, this has been part of a broader plan where they've done the fiscal mapping, the cost modeling that Krista described, and then this piece where we're looking at revenue options and strategic financing. And so this is from Wisconsin, for example, our neighbors that are about a year ahead of us on this trajectory. So then I think we're thinking about, again, developing a steering committee and a project and engaging all of you in a longer term effort to really look at various revenue raising options using this framework and others, and thinking about what it would mean to build support both in the short term and the longer term to maybe get to the 12-year plan that Krista and Rob laid out so well. So I'll just stop there. And again, we'll send out the link to the webinar. And that will be the day before we have our next general, sorry, I mispronounced Dana's name. I guess it's like Dan. Okay, so anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, so we'll be sending out the link, and this will be the day before our next planning meeting. So this piece could be part of our planning as well. But really excited. Oops, somebody took the period out. Thanks, Joe. And any questions quickly? I know we're over time, so I don't want to keep you longer than necessary. But again, seeing this first webinar as an opportunity to level set, start sharing information, and build from there. Yes, well, the webinar is open, so I would encourage people to, Marie had asked in the chat whether this webinar is open to everyone. So please do share it with your networks, anybody you think that would be interested in being part of that conversation. We'll, again, send the link out so you can forward it around. And I think we're doing this in conjunction, CDF is doing this in conjunction with the Prenatal to 3 Forum as part of our Alliance for Early Success grant. And so I think Laura has worked to get this in some pretty shape, a pretty format that we can send around and you can share with folks later. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. And thanks for your great questions and engagement.